The Galactic Council chambers on Athera Prime were always cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The enormous circular hall, carved from pale stone and lit by floating orbs of blue light, had been designed to make every species feel small. It worked. Even the tallest delegates looked like children standing beneath that vaulted ceiling. But Nate Caldwell had stopped feeling small a long time ago. He stood at the human podium, a plain metal stand compared to the ornate platforms given to the elder races. His gray suit was pressed and clean. His hands rested calmly at his sides. He was 58 years old, with deep lines around his eyes, and silver running through his dark hair. He had served as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 11 years, and before that, he had spent 2 decades in diplomatic service across human colony worlds. He had shaken hands with tyrants, shared meals with warlords, and talked desperate people away from terrible decisions. He had been insulted, threatened, and ignored more times than he could count. None of it showed on his face. He had learned a long time ago that the galaxy mistook calmness for weakness, and he had decided that was their problem, not his. The session had been going on for 3 hours. The matter was simple, or at least it should have been. A small agricultural world called Tessara, home to a quiet and peaceful species called the Omari, was dying. A fungal blight had wiped out 80% of their food crops in a single growing season. Famine had already begun. Children were starving. Human relief ships, loaded with food, seed stock, and medical supplies, had been ready to deliver aid within days. But the Valith Dominion, whose territory bordered Tessara, had refused to grant passage through their space. They claimed jurisdictional rights over the transit corridor and demanded that any aid shipments be inspected and approved by Valith Customs, a process that would take months and involve fees the Omari could never pay. Nate had brought the matter to the council floor, expecting at least some pushback against the Valith. He had presented the facts clearly. He had shown images of starving Omari families. He had outlined the timeline, how many would die for every week of delay. He had kept his voice steady and professional throughout. And then Zorath, the Dreth elder who served as council speaker, had called for a vote. The council sided with the Valith, 14-3. Only the Selenari and 2 minor species voted with humanity. The rest cited established jurisdictional tradition and respect for sovereign territorial processes. Fancy words that meant the same thing they always meant. We don't care enough to help, and we don't want to upset anyone powerful. Nate watched the vote tally appear on the display above the chamber. He didn't flinch. He didn't sigh. He simply looked at the numbers for a long moment, then picked up his datapad. Zorath leaned forward in his elevated seat at the center of the chamber. He was enormous, even by Dreth standards, nearly 3 meters tall, with gray-green skin pulled tight over a broad skull and 4 arms folded across his armored chest. His voice rumbled like stone grinding against stone. The matter is settled, Ambassador Caldwell. Perhaps in the future, humanity will learn to respect the processes of this council before bringing emotional appeals to the floor. A few delegates from other species chuckled. They always chuckled when Zorath put the humans in their place. It was a reliable source of entertainment. Nate didn't respond to the insult. He tapped his datapad twice and looked up at the chamber. Speaker Zorath, honored delegates, he said. His voice was calm and even. I have a prepared statement to read on behalf of the United Human Government. I ask for the chamber's attention. Zorath waved one of his 4 hands dismissively. You have 1 minute. Nate nodded. He didn't need more than that. Effective immediately, he began, the United Human Government is withdrawing from the Galactic Council. All treaties, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, technology sharing arrangements, joint research programs, disaster relief commitments, and diplomatic postings between humanity and the Council or any of its member species, are hereby terminated. Human personnel stationed on Council worlds and installations will be recalled within 24 hours. Human patrol ships currently operating in non-human space will return to human territory within 48 hours. This decision is final and not subject to negotiation. He closed his datapad. The chamber was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then Zorath laughed. It was a deep, booming sound that echoed off the stone walls. Several other delegates joined in, though some of their laughter sounded less certain. "A dramatic gesture, Ambassador," Zorath said, showing rows of flat teeth in what passed for a dread smile. "Humanity has always been fond of drama. You will be back within a week, begging to rejoin. You need this council far more than it needs you." Nate looked at Zorath for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness, just a deep, tired certainty. "No, Speaker Zorath," he said quietly. "We won't." His footsteps were the only sound in the chamber. Lieutenant Cora Beckett was waiting for him in the corridor outside. She was 32, sharp-featured and steady, with her dark hair pulled back in a tight knot. She had served as his military attaché for 3 years. She fell into step beside him without a word, and handed him a secure communicator. He glanced at the screen. Confirmation codes were already coming in from every human embassy, consulate, and outpost across the galaxy. Cora had activated the withdrawal protocol the moment the vote failed, just as they had planned. "How long until full extraction?" Nate asked. 14 hours for diplomatic staff. 36 for military assets. We'll be clean by tomorrow night, Cora replied. Nate nodded. Good. Behind them they heard footsteps, lighter and quicker than theirs. Ambassador Caldwell. The voice was soft and musical, with an undertone of urgency. Counselor Aisha of the Selinari stood a few paces behind them. She was slender and pale, with wide silver eyes and delicate features that made her look fragile, though Nate knew she was anything but. She had been one of the 3 who voted with humanity. She had always been one of the 3. Counselor, Nate said gently. Aisha's silver eyes were wide, with something he rarely saw in an alien face, genuine fear. Tell me this is a tactic, she said. Tell me you will negotiate. Nate shook his head slowly. It's not a tactic, Aisha. We're done. She stared at him. Then she looked down the corridor, back toward the chamber doors, where muffled sounds of casual conversation and even laughter could be heard. The rest of the council was already moving on, treating humanity's departure like a minor footnote. Aisha turned to her aide, a young Selinari standing nervously behind her, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, they weren't bluffing. And none of them understand what we just lost. 3 months passed, and the galaxy told itself that everything was fine. The elder races held their council sessions as usual. The Dreth congratulated themselves on finally being free of the noisy, emotional primates who had cluttered up the chamber with their complaints about fairness and justice. The Valif celebrated the fact that no one was challenging their territorial claims anymore. Even the smaller species, the ones who had quietly benefited from human generosity for decades, shrugged and said that they would manage. Everyone had always managed before the humans came along. They would manage again. Except they didn't. The first sign of trouble came from the Fenori Mining Guild. The Fenori were a squat, thick-skinned species who controlled most of the galaxy's rare mineral trade. They dealt with dozens of species every day, buying and selling across language barriers that would have been impossible to cross without translation software. And that software, the universal translation system that every species used without thinking about it, had been built by humans. It had been designed, coded, updated, and maintained by human engineers for over 40 years, offered freely as a public service. Nobody had ever paid for it. Nobody had ever been asked to. It was just there, like air. And like air, Nobody thought about it until it was gone. 3 months after humanity's withdrawal, the software stopped updating. It didn't crash all at once. It just slowly became less accurate. New slang wasn't added. Dialect shifts weren't accounted for. Edge cases that human programmers used to fix within days now piled up into errors that made negotiations confusing, then difficult, then impossible. A Finori trade deal with the Karathi Collective fell apart because the translation software rendered the word for partnership as something closer to surrender. Accusations flew. Trade Minister Grawl, a heavy-set Fenari with deep-set eyes and a permanent frown, spent an entire week trying to find someone, anyone, who could fix the translation system. He contacted the Dreth, the Valith, the Selinari. None of them had the expertise. The software was too complex, too deeply integrated into galactic communications. It had been a human creation from the ground up, and without humans, no one knew how to maintain it. Grawl submitted an urgent report to the Council. "We are 3 months into the human withdrawal," he wrote, "and we have already lost the ability to reliably communicate with one another." Zorath dismissed the report. "Find your own translators," he said. "The galaxy existed before the humans. It will exist after them." But the translation problem was only the beginning. Along the outer rim trade lanes, piracy had been a constant threat for centuries, until humans started patrolling those routes. Human naval vessels, fast and well-armed, had kept the major shipping corridors safe for the past 30 years. They did it without being asked, without compensation, and without recognition. Merchants from every species had grown used to traveling those lanes without fear, and most of them had forgotten why the lanes were safe in the first place. They assumed it was just the natural state of things. Within 6 weeks of humanity's withdrawal, pirate raids tripled. Within 10 weeks, they had increased by a factor of 5. Cargo ships were being hit daily. Entire convoys vanished. Insurance costs skyrocketed. Smaller trading companies went bankrupt. The Outer Rim, once a busy highway of galactic commerce, became a graveyard of burning hulls and desperate distress calls that no one answered. Captain Danny Herrera had once been one of the human freighter captains who ran supply routes through alien space. He was 41, broad-shouldered and easygoing, with a deep laugh and a reputation for helping anyone who needed it. He had pulled stranded alien ships out of debris fields, delivered emergency supplies to colonies that weren't even human, and once spent 3 days repairing a Finori mining station's life support system with his own tools and spare parts. He never asked for thanks. He rarely got any. Now Danny ran Earth-only trade routes, hauling cargo between human colonies in the safety of human-patrolled space. His ship picked up alien distress calls every day. He heard them on his bridge, voices in a dozen languages, begging for help, reporting attacks, pleading for someone to respond. He listened to every one of them, and then he switched the channel and kept flying. His first mate, a young woman named Katie Marsh, asked him once if it bothered him. Danny was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It bothers me every single day. But we spent 60 years helping them, and they spat in our faces for it. I'm not going to feel guilty for letting them figure it out on their own." Katie didn't ask again. On the Valith border, the consequences of blocking aid to Tessara were becoming impossible to ignore. The Omari famine had turned into a full collapse. Millions had died. The survivors had fled in every direction, and hundreds of thousands of refugees were now pressing against Valith space in makeshift ships and overloaded transports. The Valith, who had refused to let food through their territory, now found themselves drowning in desperate people trying to get in. Their border patrols were overwhelmed. Their detention facilities were overflowing. The crisis they had created through arrogance was now consuming them. Keth Vorin was a young Valith officer stationed at a border checkpoint. He was 26, which was young for a Valith, and he had joined the military because his family expected it, not because he believed in the Dominion's ideology of racial superiority. Every day he watched Omari refugees arrive, families with hollow eyes and thin limbs, children who had stopped crying because they didn't have the energy. He processed them, cataloged them, and sent them to holding camps that were already full. He did his job. But at night, alone in his quarters, he read the old records and discovered something that made his stomach turn. The humans had tried to save these people. They had loaded ships with food and medicine and been ready to deliver it within days. And his government had stopped them. His government had chosen pride over millions of lives, and the council had backed them up. Keth began keeping a private journal. He wrote down everything he saw, every death, every empty-eyed child, every transport that arrived too late. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but he knew someone needed to remember. Back on the council floor, Zorath maintained his composure. He told the delegates that the difficulties were temporary. He called them adjustment pains. He promised that the galaxy would soon stabilize and that humanity's absence would prove to be meaningless. Most of the elder race delegates nodded along, because nodding along was easier than admitting they had made a terrible mistake. But Counselor Aisha was not nodding. She had spent the past 3 months compiling a document, a detailed record of every service, system, and contribution that humanity had provided to the galactic community. She started with the obvious things: military patrols, disaster relief, diplomatic mediation. But the deeper she dug, the more she found. Humans had been maintaining communication satellites that other species relied on. Humans had been staffing medical research stations on the edge of wild space. Humans had been running orphanages on war-torn worlds, teaching agriculture on barren colonies, providing engineering support to species that couldn't build their own infrastructure. The list went on and on and on, page after page after page. Thousands of programs, billions of work hours, trillions in resources, all given freely, all taken for granted. Isha finished the dossier on a quiet evening in her private office. She set down her datapad and stared at the final number. Her best estimate of the total economic value of humanity's unpaid contributions to the galaxy over the past 60 years. The number was so large it seemed unreal. She checked it 3 times. It was correct. She sent a copy to Zorath. He didn't respond. 2 days later, a Fenori trade station on the Outer Rim went dark. Pirates had hit it in a coordinated attack, disabled its defenses, stripped it of cargo and fuel, and left it drifting without power. 47 Fenori crew members were dead. It was the first major station lost to piracy in over 40 years. No one came to help. There was no one left to come. The silence that humanity left behind was not quiet. It was deafening. 6 months after humanity walked away, the Galactic Council held an emergency session. It was the first emergency session in 19 years. The last one had been called when a rogue asteroid threatened a populated world, and humans had been the ones to destroy it. The chamber on Athera Prime felt different now. The floating blue orbs still glowed, and the stone walls still loomed overhead, but the air was heavier. The delegates who filed in did not carry themselves with the same easy arrogance they once had. Some of them looked tired. A few looked afraid. The human podium stood empty in its corner, plain and unremarkable, and no one looked at it directly, as if doing so would make the absence too real. Zorath opened the session. He stood at his elevated platform, all 4 arms clasped behind his back, and his voice boomed through the chamber with its usual authority. But anyone paying close attention would have noticed that his gray-green skin was paler than usual, and the deep lines around his mouth had gotten deeper. He had not been sleeping well. Not that he would ever admit it. This session has been called to address several matters of galactic stability, he said, choosing his words with care. He did not say crisis. He did not say emergency. He used the word stability because it sounded like things were still under control. They were not. Trade Minister Graal of the Fenori took the floor first. He did not bother with diplomacy. He was too tired and too angry for that. 3 more trade stations had fallen to pirate attacks in the past month. The Outer Rim was now effectively lawless. Shipping companies were refusing to send vessels beyond the core systems. Rare minerals that the galaxy depended on were not being delivered. Manufacturing on a dozen worlds had slowed to a crawl. The galactic economy had contracted by 12% in 6 months, and Graal's projections showed it getting worse. Much worse. "We need patrols," Graal said bluntly. "We need ships in those corridors. The humans used to do this. Who is going to do it now?" Silence. Zorath looked around the chamber. The Dreth had the largest fleet in the galaxy, but the Dreth did not patrol trade lanes. That was service work, beneath the dignity of a warrior race. The Valith had ships, but they were busy dealing with the refugee crisis they had created on their own border. The Selenari had the will, but not the firepower. The smaller species had nothing to offer. "Each member species will contribute vessels to a joint patrol force," Zorath announced, as if the idea had just occurred to him and not been suggested by his advisors 3 months ago. The delegates looked at each other. Nobody wanted to spend their own resources protecting trade routes that benefited everyone equally. That was exactly the kind of work humans used to do. Thankless, expensive, and essential. And it turned out that no one else wanted to do it. The session moved on to the next crisis. 2 minor species, the Torathi and the Kellen, had been locked in a border dispute for over a century. It had never erupted into war because human mediators had managed it carefully. Meeting with both sides every few months, adjusting boundaries, resolving incidents, and keeping the peace through patient, exhausting diplomacy. With the humans gone, there was no one managing the dispute. Tensions had escalated. Ships had been fired upon. Both species were mobilizing their small fleets. A war that human diplomats had prevented for 100 years was now weeks away. "Who will mediate?" asked the Torathi delegate, a nervous creature with trembling antennae. Again, silence. The Dreth didn't mediate. The Valith didn't care about minor species. The Selenari offered, but the Torathi didn't trust them because of an old trade disagreement. Every species in the chamber had a reason not to help. And without humans, who had somehow managed to be trusted by almost everyone, there was no neutral party left. The emergency session lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, nothing had been resolved. Zorath had made promises and issued directives, but everyone knew they were empty. The elder races had spent centuries building a system where the hard, unglamorous work was done by someone else. That someone else was gone, and none of them knew how to fill the gap. None of them wanted to. Counselor Aisha sat through the entire session without speaking. She had sent her dossier to every delegate in the chamber. She knew most of them hadn't read it. She also knew that the ones who had read it were the ones who looked the most frightened. Meanwhile, on Earth and the human colony worlds, things were remarkably good. The withdrawal from the Galactic Council had freed up enormous resources. Ships that had been patrolling alien trade lanes were now protecting human shipping. Scientists who had been staffing joint research stations were now working in human laboratories. Engineers who had been building infrastructure on alien worlds were now upgrading human colonies. Money that had been poured into disaster relief for ungrateful species was now being invested in human education, healthcare, and technology. The results were immediate. Human shipyards expanded production by 30%. Medical researchers, no longer sharing their findings with species that mocked them, made 3 major breakthroughs in 6 months. A new cancer treatment, an improved faster-than-light drive, and a revolutionary energy storage system. Human colony worlds that had been underfunded for years received massive investment and began to flourish. For the first time in decades, humanity was building for itself instead of for everyone else. Admiral Pete Langston oversaw the military side of the transition. He was 61, tall and lean, with a shaved head and steady gray eyes that never seemed to blink. He had spent his career watching human ships protect aliens who didn't appreciate it, and he had obeyed every order without complaint. But when the withdrawal came, he moved with a speed and precision that surprised even his own staff. Within weeks, he had repositioned every human military asset into a defensive sphere around human territory. The perimeter was tight, efficient, and virtually impenetrable. No pirate fleet, no alien armada, no coalition of angry species could breach it. Humanity was safe, and for the first time in 60 years, its military was focused entirely on keeping it that way. Langston gave a brief interview to a human news network. When asked if he was worried about alien retaliation, he almost smiled. "They can't organize a patrol of their own trade lanes," he said. "They're not going to organize an invasion." On a quiet street in a small town in Colorado, Nate Caldwell lived a simple life. He had retired from diplomatic service the day he walked out of the council chamber. He bought a modest house with a view of the mountains, planted a garden, and spent his mornings reading and his afternoons on his porch. He followed the Galactic news feeds out of habit, watching the slow unraveling of the system he had spent his career trying to work within. It didn't bring him pleasure. It brought him a deep, heavy sadness, the kind that comes from seeing something you predicted and wished you were wrong about. His niece Maggie visited him on weekends. She was 26, with her uncle's calm eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw. She was an engineer, one of the best in her class, and she was working on the new energy storage systems that were transforming human industry. She was brilliant, confident, and completely uninterested in the Galactic Council or anything to do with alien politics. To her generation, the galaxy's problems were the galaxy's problems. One evening, sitting on the porch with cups of coffee going cold between them, Maggie asked Nate if he felt guilty about walking away. Nate looked out at the mountains for a long time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "I spent 60 years of my life, my whole career, trying to help them," he said slowly, "because it was the right thing to do. And every single day they told us we were lesser. They took what we gave and they laughed at us for giving it. So no, Maggie, I don't feel guilty. You can't help people who punish you for helping." Maggie nodded. She didn't push it further. She could see the weight her uncle carried, even if he would never call it guilt. Far away, in his private chambers on Athera Prime, Zorath sat alone. The chamber was dark, except for the glow of a datapad on the table before him. He had finally opened Aisha's dossier. He had been avoiding it for months, dismissing it as Selinari sentimentality. But the emergency session had shaken something loose in him, a crack in the wall of certainty he had built around himself. He read it slowly, page after page, every human patrol route, every disaster relief mission, every agricultural program, medical outpost, orphanage, engineering project, translation update, diplomatic intervention, supply run, and rescue operation. Thousands upon thousands of entries spanning 6 decades. The numbers at the bottom of each section were staggering. The total at the end was almost incomprehensible. Zorath set down the datapad. He sat in the darkness for a very long time. And for the first time in his long life, the great Dreth Elder felt something he had never felt before. It took him a while to identify it, because it was so unfamiliar. 10 months after humanity walked away, the ships started coming. They arrived at the edge of human space one at a time, each carrying a delegation from a different species, each with a different excuse for being there. The Fenori came first because they were the most practical. They didn't bother pretending they were fine. Trade Minister Grawl himself led the delegation. Sitting across from human officials in a clean white meeting room on the border station Armstrong, and laying out his offer with blunt honesty. The Fenori would grant humans exclusive mining rights in 3 systems, reduce tariffs on human goods by 40%, and publicly acknowledge humanity's contributions to galactic trade. In exchange, they wanted human ships back on the outer rim trade lanes and human engineers to fix the translation software. Earth's new head of diplomacy listened to the offer with polite attention. She was 44 years old, with sharp dark eyes, black hair cut just above her shoulders, and a stillness about her that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. She had spent 15 years in the diplomatic corps and another 5 in intelligence work before being appointed to her current position. She was not Nate Caldwell. She did not carry his warmth or his sadness. What she carried was clarity, a perfectly clear understanding of what humanity was worth, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less. She thanked Grawl for the offer. Then she declined it. Grawl stared at her. "You haven't even made a counter-proposal," he said. "Because the framework is wrong," Laura replied calmly. "You're offering us payment for services. That means you still see us as hired help. We're not interested in being hired. We're interested in being equal partners, or we're interested in nothing at all." Grawl left the station, looking shaken. He was not used to being refused by anyone, let alone so quietly. The minor species came next, the Omari survivors, the Tarathi, the Kelun, and a dozen others who had depended on human aid and protection. They didn't have much to offer. Most of them came simply to plead. Their delegates stood in the same white meeting room and spoke with raw desperation about collapsing economies, spreading disease, and wars they couldn't stop. Some of them cried. Laura listened to every one of them with respect, and she felt genuine pain for what they were going through. But she gave them all the same answer. "Humanity is willing to help," she told them, "but not under the old terms. We will not return to a system where we do the work and the council takes the credit. If you want our help, you'll need to build something new with us, something fair." The minor species didn't fully understand what she meant, but they left with more hope than they had arrived with. At least the humans hadn't shut the door completely. Then the Valith came, and that was a different matter entirely. The Valith delegation arrived in a warship, because the Valith did everything with a warship. Their envoy was a tall, rigid officer named Ambassador Dren. He had a narrow face, cold, blue-white skin, and the stiff bearing of someone who had been trained since birth to believe his species was superior to all others. He did not use the word please in his opening remarks. He did not acknowledge any fault on the part of the Valith Dominion. Instead, he framed the meeting as a strategic realignment discussion, and proposed that humans resume their galactic duties in exchange for a formal recognition of service from the Valith. Essentially, a certificate saying that the Valith appreciated humanity's contributions. A certificate. A certificate. Laura looked at the certificate proposal on her datapad for a long moment. Then she looked up at Dren. "Ambassador," she said, "your government blocked food shipments to a starving world. Millions of Omari died. Your borders are now overwhelmed with refugees from the crisis you created. Your economy is contracting. Your military is stretched thin. And you've come here to offer us a piece of paper." Dren's jaw tightened. The Valith were not accustomed to being spoken to so directly. "The Dominion does not beg," he said stiffly. "No one is asking you to beg," Laura replied. "I'm asking you to be honest. Can you do that?" There was a long silence. Dren looked down at the table. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, and the practiced arrogance had drained out of it. "We are in serious trouble," he said quietly. "The refugee situation is beyond our capacity. Our border forces are exhausted. Disease is spreading in the camps. We don't have the medical infrastructure to handle it. The Dominion—" He paused, as if the next words physically hurt. "The Dominion needs help." Laura nodded. "Thank you for being honest," she said. "That's a start. But a start isn't enough. Go back to your government. Tell them what equal partnership means. Then come back when you're ready to discuss it seriously." Dren left. He did not look like the same person who had arrived. While the alien delegations came and went, one visitor arrived at human space, not as an official delegate, but as an individual. Counselor Aisha of the Selenari had resigned her position on the Galactic Council. She boarded a civilian transport with no escort and no diplomatic credentials, and traveled to Earth. She didn't go to the capital. She didn't request a meeting with Laura Sato, or anyone in the government. She went to Colorado. Nate Caldwell was in his garden when she arrived. He was on his knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around a row of tomato plants, when he heard a transport set down in the field behind his house. He looked up and saw Isha walking toward him across the grass. She was wearing simple clothes instead of her usual council robes, and she looked smaller without them. Older, tired. He stood up, brushed the dirt from his hands, and said, "You came a long way for a visit." "I came a long way for an honest conversation," she said. They sat on his porch. He made tea, real tea, from leaves he grew himself. The mountains stood quiet and enormous in the distance. For a while, neither of them spoke. They had known each other for over a decade, and had always respected each other, even across the vast gulf between their species. There was a trust between them that didn't need many words. "The council is dying, Nate," Isha said at last. "Not quickly, but it's dying. Everything is falling apart, and no one knows how to stop it, because no one knows how to do the things your people did. They didn't even know those things were being done." "I know," Nate said. "I read every page of my own dossier," she continued. "And even I was surprised. I thought I understood what humanity contributed. I didn't. Not even close. No one did." Nate sipped his tea. "That was partly our fault," he said. "We did it all so quietly. We never demanded recognition. We never said, 'Look at what we're doing for you.' We just did it because it needed doing. And when you do things quietly for long enough, people stop seeing it." Isha set down her cup. "What would it take to bring humanity back?" Nate looked at her for a long time. His eyes were kind but firm. "We're not coming back, Isha," he said. "Not to the old council. That's over. Then what? If you want us in your future, you'll have to build something new. Something where we're equals from day one. Not guests, not workers, not the species that does the jobs nobody else wants. Equals, full partners with full say and full respect." Aisha nodded slowly. She had expected this answer, but hearing it still hit her hard. "The elder races will never agree to that," she said. "Then the elder races will have to learn," Nate replied simply. Back on Ethera Prime, Zorath made his last desperate move. He had spent weeks trying to rally the elder races into a military coalition, a united fleet that would, in his words, remind humanity of the Council's authority, and pressure them into returning to the table. He framed it as a show of strength, not an act of war, but everyone understood what he really meant. He wanted to scare the humans into coming back. The coalition talks lasted 2 days. On the first day, the Dreth and the Valeth argued about who would command the joint fleet. The Dreth insisted on Dreth leadership. The Valeth refused to serve under anyone. On the second day, the Fenori pulled out entirely, saying they couldn't afford to divert ships from protecting their own crumbling train routes. By the end of the second day, the coalition was dead. No fleet was assembled. No message was sent to humanity. The elder races couldn't even cooperate long enough to threaten someone together. Zorath sat alone in the empty council chamber that night. The floating orbs had dimmed to a faint glow. The podiums stood in their circle like gravestones. The human podium, plain and metal, still sat in its corner. No one had removed it. No one had wanted to. For the first time, Zorath understood something he had refused to see for his entire career. Power without service was just noise. Authority, without the willingness to do the hard, thankless work of holding things together, was nothing more than a title on an empty chair. The humans had understood this. They had lived it every day for 60 years, and the galaxy had laughed at them for it. 18 months after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, a new summit was held. It did not take place on Aethera Prime. It did not take place on any world belonging to an elder race. It was held on a human-built space station called the Meridian, orbiting a neutral star at the edge of human territory. The station was elegant, in the way human engineering always was, functional, clean, and quietly beautiful. Its corridors were wide and well lit. Its meeting halls had large windows that looked out into open space, where stars burned in silence against the black. It was a place designed not to impress or intimidate, but to make people feel welcome. That, too, was a very human thing. The summit was not Nate Caldwell's idea. It was not Laura Sato's idea. It was Aisha's. After her visit to Colorado, the former Selinari counselor had spent months traveling between species, building something that had never existed before. A coalition from the bottom up. She started with the minor species, the ones who had suffered most from humanity's absence. The Omari survivors, the Tarathi, the Kelun, small overlooked peoples who had never had real power in the old council. They were desperate and willing to try anything, and Aisha gave them something they had never been offered before, a seat at a table where their voice actually mattered. From the minor species, she reached out to the Selinari government, which backed her immediately. Then slowly and carefully, she approached the Fenori. Grawl was skeptical at first. He was a practical man, and he didn't believe in grand gestures. But Aisha showed him the numbers, what the galaxy was losing every month, what it would continue to lose, and what a genuine partnership with humanity could look like. Grawl studied the numbers, grunted, and said he would attend the summit. That was as close to enthusiasm as a Fenori ever got. The Valith were harder. Ambassador Dren had returned from his meeting with Laura Sato and delivered an honest report to his government. It had not been well received. The Dominion's ruling council had called him weak, stripped him of his rank, and appointed a harder diplomat in his place. But the harder diplomat lasted 3 months before resigning in frustration, because the problems Dren had described only got worse. The refugee camps were overflowing. Disease was killing thousands. The Valith economy was contracting. Eventually, quietly, the Dominion reinstated Dren and told him to do whatever was necessary. He accepted the invitation to the summit. Keth Voren, the young border officer who had been keeping his journal of the refugee crisis, was part of the Valith delegation. He had been promoted, not for his loyalty to the Dominion, but because his honest reports from the border had caught the attention of officers who were tired of being lied to. He arrived at the Meridian, carrying a bag and his journal. Looking around the human station with wide eyes. He had never been inside a human structure before. It was nothing like he had been taught to expect. It was warm. It was welcoming. There were plants growing along the corridors. The human delegation was led by Laura Sato. She arrived with a team of diplomats, legal experts, and technical advisors, all of them prepared to negotiate in detail. She wore a dark suit and carried herself with the same calm precision she always had. But those who knew her well could see something new in her expression. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. A crack in the armor she wore. Maggie Caldwell was there too. She led the engineering team that would design the technical infrastructure for whatever new agreement the summit produced. Communication systems, logistics networks, shared databases. She was 28 now, confident and focused, with her sleeves rolled up and a datapad in her hand at all times. She had none of her uncle's sadness. She had the energy of someone who believed the future could be built, not just endured. And Nate Caldwell came. He was not a delegate. He held no official position. He came as an observer, at Isha's personal invitation. He wore a simple jacket and sat in the gallery above the main hall, watching the delegations file in. He looked older than he had 18 months ago. His hair was fully silver now, and he moved more slowly. But his eyes were the same, calm, watchful, and deeply aware of everything happening around him. The negotiations were hard. They were always going to be hard. The first 3 days were spent arguing about the basic structure of the new compact. The minor species wanted equal voting rights, regardless of population or military power. The Fenori wanted weighted votes based on economic contribution. The Veilith wanted veto power for any species with a fleet above a certain size. Laura Sato listened to all of these proposals, took notes, and then presented humanity's position. One species, one vote, no vetoes, no exceptions. The Veilith delegation nearly walked out. Dren had to spend an entire night talking them down. He told them what he had come to believe after months of watching his government fail. That the old way of doing things was killing them, and that pride would finish the job if they let it. The Dreth were not present. Zorath had been stripped of his title as council speaker after the coalition fiasco, and the Dreth government had not responded to the summit invitation. They were too proud to attend a meeting organized by minor species and held on a human station. Their absence was noted by everyone, but mourned by no one. By the 5th day, the outline of something new was beginning to take shape. They called it the Compact of Meridian. Its principles were simple, because the best principles always are. Every species would contribute to collective security according to its ability. Every species would have equal representation in decision-making. Aid and support would be shared freely, not as charity, but as mutual investment. No species would be expected to carry burdens that others refuse to share. The work of holding the galaxy together would be everyone's work, not just humanity's. Aisha presented the final draft to the assembled delegations on the 7th day. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her could hear the emotion underneath. She had spent 18 months building this moment, traveling to dozens of worlds, talking to hundreds of officials, arguing, persuading, and refusing to give up. She had done it, not because she was human, but because she had learned from humans. She had watched Nate Caldwell give everything he had to a galaxy that didn't deserve it, and she had decided that the galaxy needed to become worthy of what it had been given. The signing ceremony took place in the main hall of the Meridian, beneath the wide windows that looked out into space. Ships from dozens of species hung in the darkness outside. Fenori transports, Selenari cruisers, Tarathi scout ships, Kellen freighters, Omari civilian vessels, even a handful of Veilith warships. They had come from across the galaxy, and together they formed a fleet that was messy, uncoordinated, and beautiful. Each delegation signed the compact in turn. The minor species went first, because for the first time in galactic history, they were being put first. The Fenori signed with characteristic efficiency. The Veilith signed last, and Dren's hand shook slightly as he pressed his mark to the document. He looked up and met Laura Sato's eyes. She gave him a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. It was enough. After the ceremony, the hall filled with conversation and cautious celebration. Species that had never spoken to each other were talking. Nagy Caldwell was already in a corner with a group of Fenori and Selenari engineers, sketching out plans for the new shared communication network on her datapad, talking fast and drawing diagrams in the air with her hands. Katie Marsh, Danny Herrera's former first mate, had joined the diplomatic support team and was helping minor species delegates navigate the station. Even Keth Voren was there, standing by a window, looking out at the gathered ships and writing in his journal. Nate Caldwell stood at a viewport on the observation deck, away from the crowd. He was too old and too honest to make promises about the future. It will if they remember what it cost to get here, he said. Isha looked out at the gathered fleet. Dozens of species, hundreds of ships, all of them present by choice for the first time in galactic history. She thought about the empty Omari fields, the burning trade stations, the dead children in the refugee camps, and the long, terrible silence that had taught the galaxy what it should have known all along. "We remember," she said quietly. The Compact's first joint mission launched 2 weeks later. A combined fleet carrying food, medicine, and engineering teams to a struggling colony world on the Outer Rim. Human ships flew alongside Fenori transports and Selinari cruisers. Valith medical teams worked beside Omari volunteers. It was slow and clumsy, and nothing like the smooth, efficient operations humans had once run alone. But it was shared. It was equal. And it was real. Nate Caldwell heard about it on the news. He was sitting on his porch in Colorado, a cup of coffee in his hand, the morning air cool and sharp with the smell of pine. The mountains stood against a pale blue sky, enormous and patient, the way they had stood for millions of years before any species had ever looked up and wondered what lay beyond the stars. He read the report on his datapad. He saw the images, ships from a dozen species flying together, people of different worlds working side by side, a colony that had been dying, now receiving what it needed to live. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and uncertain and fragile, but it was a beginning. Nate smiled. He set down the datapad, leaned back in his chair, and watched the sun come up over the mountains.